she would not have written it without reason. Without waiting for anyone's approval, I unfolded the pages. 3 sheets, written in her steady handwriting from 2 years before she became ill. Rex tried to step toward me, claiming she wasn't thinking clearly when she wrote it, but Aunt Carol's voice cut in firmly from across the yard, stating she had witnessed my mother write and sign it long before any diagnosis. Rex stopped in his tracks. I calmly reminded him that he had already spoken enough, and now it was my mother's turn. Donna stood quietly behind him, watching everything unfold. A warm breeze moved through the yard, brushing the pages in my hands. 31 people leaned in without realizing it. I began reading aloud. "Hi, sweet Myra," I said, steadying my voice. "If you are reading this, I am no longer there, and I am sorry, not for leaving this world, but for the years I stayed silent when I should have spoken." The yard was so still I could hear ice shifting in the coolers as I continued reading her words. Words that were finally about to be heard. My mother's letter went on to reveal that my father had told everyone I was an accident and that he had always wanted a son. She wrote that she needed me to know the truth because it was the last important gift she could give me. Rex told me to stop reading, but I kept going. In her words, she explained that she had wanted me more than anything. She spent 2 years trying to have a child, visiting a fertility clinic, receiving hormone injections every week, and going for monthly blood tests. She drove to appointments alone because my father believed it was a waste of money. He never wanted a child and often said they were too expensive, even saying he would rather buy a boat than raise a child. When she finally became pregnant, she told him the child might not be a boy, and he responded that he would not be happy unless it was. Then I was born, and she said I became everything to her. I paused while reading, seeing my father's face shift into an expression I had never seen before, something deeper than anger or embarrassment. She wrote that he spent years resisting the idea of becoming a father and only agreed after she told him she would leave if he refused again. From the back of the yard, Aunt Carol confirmed that the letter was written 2 years before my mother's illness and that she was completely clear-minded when she wrote it. Rex stood silently, holding his beer as condensation dripped onto his shoe. Suddenly he moved toward me, reaching for the letter, demanding it. Before he could reach me, Jake Whitmore stood up and stepped between us. Jake spoke calmly, telling Rex to let me finish. Rex dismissed him, saying it was a family matter, but Jake simply replied that it looked like family business to him. Rex tried to rally the crowd, asking if anyone would support him, shouting that it was his house and his family. I spoke only 2 words in response without raising my voice. "My house." The word hung in the air. For the first time I saw my father truly hear what I was saying. The people around the yard had not moved, but the feeling in the space had changed. No one stood with Rex anymore, even if they were still sitting in their chairs. I turned to the second page of the letter and said this was the part that really mattered. My mother wrote that my father had called the house his for decades, repeating "my house, my rules" so often that everyone believed it. I could see some people nodding because they had heard him say it many times. The letter explained that the house at 414 Maple Lane was bought using $180,000 given by my grandparents, David and Ruth Whitmore, as an early inheritance for my mother. It was money meant to give her something she could truly call her own after marriage. The deed was always in my mother's name, Ellen Whitmore Harper. My father's name was never added to the property, and he never paid for it or legally shared ownership. It was simply not his house, and it never had been. As I read this, my father's face turned pale in a sudden, complete way, like a screen losing power all at once. I continued reading that my mother had prepared a legal will with attorney Richard Avery and had it witnessed by her sister, Aunt Carol. The house was left to me, filed properly and already processed through probate after her death. By the time I was reading the letter, the ownership had legally transferred to me. I took out the documents I had brought, the recorded deed copy and the certified will page, and placed them on the table beside the quitclaim deed my father had wanted me to sign. The truth sat beside the lie in plain view. Donna spoke first from near the gate, admitting that Rex had told her the house was his. Rex insisted it was his home because he had lived there for 30 years. Aunt Carol calmly said that living in a house doesn't make it yours. Ownership depends on who paid for it, and Rex had not. Uncle Bill stared silently at the papers, silently processing how the story he believed for decades had just changed. Rex stood in the yard surrounded by people who had gathered for a simple celebration, yet he suddenly had no argument left. His hand trembled as he held his beer and reached toward my letter. I didn't raise my voice. I simply said there was more, the way a nurse tells a family that important news is not finished. I returned to my mother's letter and read that before she died, she discovered my father had tried to obtain a second mortgage using a house he did not legally own. The bank contacted the family attorney because his name was not on the deed and the loan was denied. My mother realized then that if he was willing to borrow against a house he didn't own while she was alive, he might try to take it from me after she was gone. I placed the letter down. The yard absorbed the truth in layers. First the close relatives, then the neighbors, then the church members, all growing quiet. Donna suddenly asked Rex if he had tried to mortgage the house without ownership, saying she knew what financial fraud looked like. She then left, shutting the gate behind her, starting her car and driving away without another word. Rex sat down slowly in his chair as if his strength had left him. One page of the letter was still unread. I almost stopped because the facts had already spoken, but the final page was about something deeper. My hands began to tremble, not from fear, but from the sadness of everything that had happened. I read aloud that the last words were meant for me alone. The yard stayed completely still. Somewhere down the street, a bottle rocket burst into the sky with a sharp whistle, but no one reacted. My mother's letter spoke next about her marriage. She said she spent 30 years with my father and never once told him no, never raised her voice, and never left even when she knew she should have. She believed she was keeping the family together for my sake, but in truth she admitted she was afraid. Her voice on the page felt honest and vulnerable. She wrote that what troubled her the most was how, whenever my father yelled at me instead of her, a small part of her felt relieved because the anger was directed away from her, and she hated herself for feeling that way every single time. Cousin Patty was crying quietly and Uncle Bill stood up, walked to the patio edge and turned away from everyone with his hands in his pockets. My mother wrote that she could not undo the past, but she could give me something she never had. The house belonged to me, along with the $220,000 trust she helped establish with Aunt Carol. She said this was her apology and her love placed together. The final sentence was underlined twice. It said I was not an accident, that I was the child she fought hardest to have, and that I should never be afraid to speak the word no. I carefully folded the letter and returned it to the envelope, placing it back in my scrub pocket close to my heart. Rex sat silently in his chair, beer dripping slightly onto the grass beside him. 31 people around the yard avoided his eyes. Only the sounds of a flag snapping in the distance and a dog barking from another street broke the quiet. The grill continued to smoke softly, and the string lights my mother had hung years ago began glowing as evening approached. No one left. No one spoke. Rex looked around slowly, searching for the people who used to support him, the ones who agreed when he said the house was his or laughed when he spoke about wanting a son. No one returned his gaze. Finally, he said that people were choosing to believe a dead woman over him. The words landed heavily and no one responded. Jake calmly said that they were choosing to believe legal documents, a notarized will and a property deed. Aunt Carol stepped beside me, steady and strong, telling Rex that attorney Richard Avery held the original documents and advising him to speak with his own lawyer if he had questions. She added that he would likely need legal help. I gathered the papers from the table, placed them neatly in a stack and put my mother's letter back in my pocket. Then I stood and spoke my final words to my father. I told him I was not selling the house, not signing anything and not asking for his permission. I looked at him once more and saw a man sitting in a yard he did not legally own, holding authority he no longer had. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, not pitiful, just finally and honestly measured. I left through the side gate with Aunt Carol and Jake walking beside me. Behind us, the 31 guests stayed seated with their food, sparklers, and the remains of a story that had ruled them for 3 decades. The next part is simple. The lawyer, Richard Avery, sent a certified letter to Rex the following Monday stating clearly that the property at 414 Maple Lane belonged to me according to my mother's valid will and probate records, and that my father had no legal claim to the estate. Rex was formally notified that he was occupying the property without legal ownership and was given 60 days to leave the house. The process was straightforward and legally standard, with no drama attached. He never hired a lawyer, likely because he could not afford one. Later, I learned from Uncle Bill that Rex had about $38,000 in credit card debt after seeing a statement on the kitchen counter. When combined with his auto loan for the Dodge Ram, the expensive grill, and the lifestyle he tried to maintain, his finances were collapsing. The house he tried to claim, valued around $280,000 according to Donna's real estate analysis, was never legally his to sell. The second mortgage he attempted was rejected because his name was not on the deed. The quit-claim deed he wanted me to sign was the only way his plan might have worked, and I never signed it. His strategy depended entirely on one assumption: that I would be too afraid to say no. Donna stopped returning his calls within a week and blocked his number by the end of the month. I hold no anger toward Donna. She was searching for financial security in a partner, and Rex had presented himself as someone with assets. That was not love, but it was also not my responsibility. My mother's trust fund contained $220,000, enough to clear my student loans, build an emergency savings fund, and support my future. She had arranged this quietly from her hospital bed while Rex worked in the garage, polishing his truck. Together with Aunt Carol, she created legal protection using proper documentation and notarization. 2 weeks after the barbecue, Uncle Bill called me while I was sitting on the front porch of the Maple Lane house, drinking coffee and watching sunlight touch the hydrangeas. My first thought was not to answer, remembering how he once called me selfish and sent articles criticizing adult children. But I picked up the phone anyway. He stayed silent for a moment before apologizing, saying he had believed everything Rex told him, that I didn't visit, didn't care, and was abandoning my father. He later learned from Carol that I had accompanied my mother to every chemotherapy appointment for more than a year, while Rex had told people I refused to help. I felt the old pain of being misunderstood, knowing the lie had spread long before the truth. Uncle Bill also admitted that Rex had once asked him to co-sign a $20,000 personal loan, which Bill refused because it felt wrong. Before ending the call, Bill said he believed my mother would have been proud of me. I sat on the porch for a long time after that conversation. At the end of August, after the 60-day notice expired, I moved into the Maple Lane house. Rex had already left and surprisingly cleaned the place, emptying the kitchen trash and wiping surfaces. The old recliner he loved was gone, the only item he clearly took with him. The living room felt larger and brighter without it, so I placed a new reading chair there that I found through the same estate sale network my mother enjoyed. The first thing I did was hang my parents' wedding photo back in its place, retrieving it from a garage box labeled "Donate" in Rex's handwriting. I also found my mother's winter coat, several of her favorite books, and at the bottom of the box, carefully wrapped in a dish towel, the nearly empty bottle of Chanel No. 5 perfume. I placed it back on the vanity exactly where it had always stood. That first evening, Aunt Carol came over carrying homemade lasagna and a bottle of wine that was far better than anything my father ever served at the table. We sat quietly at the kitchen counter, comfortable without conversation. Jake helped carry my boxes upstairs and simply asked if I was planning to take the master bedroom. I told him yes. That night, I sat at my mother's old vanity, looking into the oval mirror she had used every morning for 3 decades. I placed her letter against the mirror as if it were part of the room, then went outside to water the hydrangeas she loved. I was living in my mother's house, the house she fought to protect, and now it was my home. Sometimes I imagine what would have happened if I had signed the paper at the barbecue, if I had followed my father's expectations the way my mother once did, and if I had carried that silent role into another generation. But I believe she wrote that letter so I wouldn't have to repeat her life. She spent her final healthy months making sure I had both emotional and legal strength to stand on my own. I want to ask you something gently. Has there been someone in your life you were afraid to say no to, someone who spoke your story louder than you felt able to speak it yourself? I would truly love to hear your experience in the comments. 6 months after the barbecue, Uncle Bill gave me an update about Rex. He had moved into Bill's spare bedroom and was working extra shifts at the auto parts store, still carrying the title of assistant manager but feeling bitter about it. Without the house, he had lost the comfort of the life he tried to build on something that was never his. Bill said Rex spent most evenings watching television on a small screen he had brought from Maple Lane and rarely talked about the barbecue or much else. Donna had blocked Rex completely, phone, email, and social media, and had moved on to a new real estate listing and, likely, a new relationship with someone who could prove ownership of their property. I never contacted my father during those 6 months, but I want to be clear about one thing. I did not close the door forever. I simply said what I needed to say and waited. If he ever calls, I told Carol one Sunday over coffee, I will answer, but only if he begins with the truth. No excuses, no rewritten history, just honesty. Carol agreed and said that if he never calls, that is also his decision. I felt peace with both possibilities. The one where my father finds the courage to be honest and the one where he does not. Either way, I am living in my own house, paying my own expenses, sleeping in the room that still carries the soft scent of Chanel No. 5. No one will ever again hand me a pen and ask me to sign away what my mother protected for me. When people ask whether the confrontation was worth it or whether I feel satisfied, I tell them this. I did not act out of revenge or to shame my father. I stood up because my mother asked me to, not directly but through every word she left in that letter. She wanted me to become the woman she could not be, and the smallest way I could honor her was to speak when she would have stayed silent. My mother spent 30 years living in fear. She cooked, cleaned, and stayed quietly beside a man who treated her life as if it belonged to him. The one regret she carried was allowing his anger to be directed at me because it meant she was spared. She wrote this very honestly in her letter, without excuses or dramatic language. Just the simple truth she should have been allowed to speak all along. I want to be clear that I do not hate my father. Hate is a heavy feeling that would take energy away from my work, my garden, and the peaceful dinners I share with Carol and Jake. What I feel is something quieter. A clear understanding that he saw family as something he could control rather than something he needed to protect. When the legal facts were revealed, he had nothing truly in his name. That 4th of July taught me something important. Setting boundaries is not selfish, and silence is not the same as peace. People who pressure you to keep the family together are often the ones who are not personally carrying the pain. My mother understood this, but she had to pass away before she could speak it openly, and that realization still hurts. This morning before my hospital shift, I went outside at about 6 o'clock to water the hydrangeas. The early light was soft and blue, and the street was very quiet. I stood barefoot in the yard the way my mother used to, stepping over the porch boards she had once learned to avoid, even though I had repaired them in September. She planted those hydrangea bushes during the first spring after moving into the house. My father wanted them removed because he believed they took too much space, wanting more room for a grill and horseshoe pit. But my mother said no. It was one of the few times she truly stood her ground. She stayed in the garden with dirt on her knees, holding a small trowel, and said, "These stay." And they stayed for 30 years. Through arguments, long silences, and moments when my father loudly claimed the yard as his, the hydrangeas kept blooming, blue, purple, stubborn, and alive. I think often about how my mother lost most battles inside her marriage but protected the flowers. She chose one thing worth fighting for and held it tightly with both hands in the soil. She could not fully protect herself, but she preserved the hydrangeas, the deed, and the letter. I turned off the hose and stood quietly in my yard as the house glowed softly behind me in the early morning light. If someone asks whether what I did was revenge, I will say it was not revenge. It was a promise I made to my mother and kept. I believe she would be proud of that. This is my story, and I truly thank you for listening to it. I know it was long, and I know some parts were painful to hear because they were just as hard to share. If any part of this story felt familiar, if you have sat at a table where someone tried to make you feel small, if you have held a pen over a document you knew you shouldn't sign, or if you have loved someone who could not protect you but still found a way to forgive them, I would genuinely like to hear your experience in the comments. If this story touched you, please consider liking and subscribing, not for popularity, but so someone else who needs to hear this message can find it. And if you want to hear another story, there is one linked below about a woman whose family tried to remove her place at the Thanksgiving table. She didn't have a letter from her mother, but she had something else, and I think you will want to know how that story ends. I am Myra, 28 years old, an ICU nurse, living in my mother's house on Maple Lane, where the hydrangeas continue blooming every summer without asking anyone's permission.